Picture a ship. Not a grand vessel, but a small, wooden ship tossed on the gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. For months, it's been your entire world. Inside, people are dreaming. They're dreaming of gold, of adventure, of a new life in a new world. They are sailing toward a promise. Now, when we think of early American settlers and a great mystery, our minds often go to the lost colony of Roanoke, the settlement that vanished, leaving behind only a single cryptic word, Croton. It's a haunting story. But the story we're exploring today is different. It's about the colony that came after Roanoke, the one that was supposed to succeed where the other had failed. This is the story of Jamestown. And it's not the story of a people who vanished, it's the story of a people who almost did. This isn't just a history lesson. Think of it as a survival guide, written in the soil and sorrows of the first permanent English settlement in America. These are the brutal lessons they learned, lessons that forged the beginning of a nation. In the spring of 1607, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. After weeks of searching, the 104 men and boys aboard chose a spot. It was an island nestled along a river they named the James, in honor of their king. On paper, it seemed perfect. It was uninhabited, and the deep water allowed them to moor their ships right against the shore. It was also easily defensible from Spanish ships, their main fear at the time. But they had made a terrible, almost fatal mistake. The land was swampy, marshy. The water they drank from the river was tidal, a mix of fresh and salt water, making it unsafe to drink for much of the year. The air, thick and humid in the summer, was a paradise for mosquitoes, which carried deadly diseases like malaria and typhoid. And then there was the question of the settlers themselves. They weren't farmers or builders. Many were gentlemen, men from wealthy families who had never performed a day of manual labor in their lives. They came to find gold, not to till soil. They brought faith and ambition, but very few practical skills. They had chosen the wrong place, and in many ways, they were the wrong people for the job. The first few years were a cycle of death and desperation. Ships would arrive with new colonists, only for them to succumb to disease, malnutrition, or conflicts with the native Powhatan people, whose ancestral lands they had just occupied. The dream was already turning into a nightmare. By the fall of 1609, the situation was at a breaking point. A new fleet of supply ships had been crippled by a hurricane. The colony's tough and pragmatic leader, Captain John Smith, had been badly injured in a gunpowder explosion and forced to return to England. The colonists, now numbering around 300, were left to face the coming winter with dwindling supplies and no strong leader. The local Powhatan, wary and weary of the English, created a blockade around the fort. The settlers were trapped. The season that followed would be known forever as the starving time. Imagine the cold of a Virginia winter seeping through the thin walls of a wooden hut. Imagine the silence, broken only by the wind and the groans of the sick. The fort's gates were sealed. There was no hunting, no foraging. There was only waiting. The food ran out quickly. They ate their horses, then their dogs and cats, then the rats and mice that scurried through the fort. They boiled the leather from their shoes and belts just to have something to chew. Archaeological evidence from Jamestown confirms the grim stories once dismissed as rumors. Scratches and butcher marks on the bones of a 14-year-old girl, whom scientists have named Jane, tell a story of last resort, unthinkable survival. They were pushed to the very edge of their humanity. Of the hundreds of colonists who began that winter, only about 60 were still alive by the spring of 1610. They were skeletal figures, barely human. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. They had learned the hardest lesson of all, that civilization is a fragile thing, and hunger can erase it in a matter of weeks. Before he was forced to leave, Captain John Smith had imposed a simple, brutal rule that had kept the colony afloat. He that will not work shall not eat. It was harsh, but it was fair. He forced the gentlemen to build, to plant, to contribute. He was a flawed, often arrogant man, but he understood the reality of their situation. Smith was also the primary diplomat with the Powhatan people. This relationship was complex, a mix of trade, suspicion, and outright conflict. It was during this time that the famous story of Pocahontas took place. But she wasn't the woman from the Disney movies. She was a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, the daughter of the powerful chief Powhatan. She served as a vital intermediary, an ambassador between two worlds that did not understand each other. Her presence helped to temporarily ease tensions and facilitate trade that kept the colonists from starving in those earlier years. Her story is not one of romance, but one of diplomacy and courage in a dangerous time. When Smith left, that structure and that fragile diplomacy crumbled, contributing directly to the disaster of the starving time. It proved that in a crisis, you need more than just hope. You need a leader who can make hard decisions. In May of 1610, the survivors of the starving time decided they could take no more. They abandoned Jamestown. They boarded their small ships, ready to sail for home, to leave the cursed land behind for good. The great English experiment in America was over. But as they sailed down the James River, they saw something on the horizon. Ships. It was a new governor, Lord de la Warr, arriving with a year's worth of supplies and 150 new colonists. He ordered them to turn back. Jamestown was saved at the last possible second. But saving the people wasn't enough. The colony needed a purpose. It needed a way to sustain itself. The gold was never found. What was the point of all this suffering? The answer came from a man named John Rolfe. He was a survivor of the hurricane that had delayed the supply fleet. And he had an idea. He began experimenting with a new type of tobacco seed from the Caribbean. The native tobacco was harsh, but this new hybrid plant thrived in the Virginia soil. The finished product was sweet, aromatic, and wildly popular back in England. Suddenly, Jamestown had found its gold. It wasn't yellow and shiny, it was green and leafy. Tobacco saved Jamestown economically. It gave the colony a reason to exist and a way to prosper. But this green gold had a dark side. It was a labor-intensive crop, and its success created a ravenous demand for land and labor. This demand would fuel further conflict with the Native Americans and, just a decade later, lead to the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in English North America in 1619. The solution to one crisis laid the foundation for another, one that would shape the course of American history for centuries. So what can we take away from this survival guide written by the colonists of Jamestown? The lessons are stark. Choose your ground carefully. Be aware of the world you're stepping into. Understand that true hunger can push people to limits we can't imagine. Recognize that strong, pragmatic leadership is essential when things fall apart. And finally, be willing to adapt, to find your gold where you least expect it. The story of Jamestown is not a simple one of heroes and villains. It's a messy, complicated, and often brutal story of survival. It's about people who faced the absolute worst of circumstances, who were pushed to the edge, and who, against all odds, held on. Their perseverance laid the foundation for a country. Their flaws, their conflicts, and the systems they created, for both good and ill, are woven into the fabric of America today. They were not lost, but their story reminds us of what it costs to be found. It makes you wonder, faced with the same choices, who among us would have survived?